Thank you, Chairman Capriglione, members. Brent Bennett, the Policy Director for the Life Powered campaign at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. Thank you for inviting me today to come talk about this issue a little bit. And I think it's an optimistic. I want to sound a tone of optimism and progress that the state of Texas and in general the country I think has made on these issues. A lot of my testimony that was kind of points were covered by previous witnesses, so I just want to fill in a little bit about a little bit of details about that. I think that the biggest problem with ESG from our standpoint is that consumer investor preferences have been around since the dawn of investing, right? People have had preferences to invest in one type of company or another, especially the Catholic Church, for example, is going back to the 60s, even before that, would not invest in certain companies. People didn't want to invest in tobacco, et cetera. So that's, those preferences have always existed. What's different about the ESG movement is the collusive nature of these activist organizations that try to either persuade or convince financial institutions to adopt these certain policies, whether it's endorsing the Paris Agreement and net zero goals, whether it's diversity goals, et cetera, and trying to use their power as investors to apply that across the entire American economy, right? So I think that's the fundamental difference between what this is and just normal consumer preferences, which is totally fine in a competitive market. And so I think what's happened recently and what we've seen in terms of companies like BlackRock and others leaving Climate Action 100 and some of these groups is that these groups have now moved from what was just a regime of trying to get companies to disclose information about emissions or other things to actually setting enforceable targets. And what we saw as these companies pulled out was that they saw that as being a very clear antitrust violation. If they were to collaborate together to enforce, to try to get companies to actually set enforceable targets and dictate business actions and terms in that way, rather than just disclosing information about emissions. And so that's what's led to the recent exodus of a lot of these companies from these activist groups. But the fact is, there's still dozens of American companies that are involved in these groups. They still exist. And again, as I show in Figure 1 on the first page of my written testimony, it's kind of a classic hub and spoke conspiracy where there's this collaboration, not directly between all of these entities, but through the activist organizations that kind of serve as the hub for the spokes of the antitrust conspiracy. So that's where we find issue with what's going on here. And it's been a positive step that a lot of companies are also recognizing that there's a risk to that and that they should back away from that and get back to doing what they think is best for their investors and their portfolio companies. And I would also say too that pressure has been driven by investigations by the state's attorney general, which our attorney general is part of. That they're investigating and continuing to keep an eye out for antitrust violations in that space. So it's important that I think our attorneys generals continue to do that. The other thing that's that's been a positive development, and was covered by some of our pension leaders here, is that on the proxy voting side now, there's been a lot more, thanks to Texas and other states stepping up and saying we want different policies. There's been a development of different policies. And that's, again, I think what Texas is doing, and I think what the right way to apply Senate Bill 13, in particular in Senate Bill 19, which is the firearms legislation, is Texas is exercising its role as a consumer, as a consumer in the marketplace, right? It's not telling companies what to do, but it's saying we are going to choose to do business with companies and set policies according to what our legislature and what's best for our economy. And so therefore companies will respond to that by offering different choices, different platforms, et cetera. So I think that's been a positive development of what's happened here. And you can see in Figure 2 on the third page of my written testimony, prior to the implementation of these new proxy voting policies, and the companies, we surveyed just kind of a subset of energy and utility and banking companies, and how TRS and ERS was voting on environmental resolutions. And prior to the implementation of these policies in 2023, actually they were voting for these resolutions at a higher rate than the broader industry. And certainly in contradiction to their own proxy voting policies that state that they shouldn't vote for resolutions that push social or environmental policy. So once TRS and ERS engaged with their proxy advisor, as they discussed earlier, and set these new policies, in the last 2 years, 2023 and 2024, they voted for none of these resolutions. So I think it's, again, a positive note that we can make changes as consumers at minimal cost, and kind of at least right our own ship in terms of how we are positioning ourselves relative to these issues, not being for or against anything else politically, but being in a neutral position. Unfortunately, the federal government, with particularly the SEC, is allowing more resolutions to be brought forward, which makes it harder to do this in the proxy voting space. And also, the climate emissions disclosure rule that's being litigated right now, again, is trying to push more of this out, and makes it harder in reality for a lot of our companies or a lot of our pensions to know what to do in these situations. But I think, again, the key going forward, and I think this is embodied in Senate Bill 1446 last session, which we hope is brought forward again, is that if there's clear standards and transparency and oversight within, as far as what's going on in terms of investments, particularly, especially private investments too, not just our public equities, but also our private investments, and how proxy voting and how proxies are being voted, that then this can be worked out, regardless of what the landscape looks like, that we can position ourselves correctly as a state. And so we hope that the legislature will bring that bill back and pass it next session with some improvements, and that we can continue to kind of make this progress going forward. So thank you for hearing me. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, members. Any questions?
Thank you, Chairman. Thanks for being here. Appreciate your testimony. Just wanted to ask about the issue that I'm having here is that government overreach in businesses is not the Texas way. So I'm just trying to figure out, how are we now mandating certain things for funds, whether to invest in this or not. And like I said, I run a private equity firm. My fiduciary responsibility is to make the most amount of money for my investors, right? Wherever I invest in that's my decision, right? And if my investors want certain things, and we can look at that, but that's my decision to make. The government shouldn't be telling me as a private equity firm to invest in this or that, or to stay away from this or that. So I'm just trying to figure out, how can we create a better environment for businesses to allow them to make that decision while still making sure that nobody else hijacks that decision for them. Does that make sense?
Correct. Yes. Thank you, Representative Majani. I think the difference is, the key is to differentiate between the government, where government regulation is, versus how the government and state pensions are managing their own investments, right? So as state pensions managing their investments, they choose who they work with, what they invest in. That is not dictating to companies what companies should do. It's dictating to companies what they should do if they want to do business with the state. But again, that's the state acting as a consumer in the marketplace. So I think as long as the state stays within that realm, then we're supportive of certain actions to do that. I think it's if the state were to get out of that realm and into trying to dictate regulation, right, and something like that, that's where it gets dangerous, I think, as to what you're getting at. That's how I understand it. That's where, yes, it can be very dangerous for the state to get involved in that. We would not want to set a precedent in that regard. But I think in terms of how the state is investing its own money and who it does business with, then it's acting as a consumer in the marketplace and has a role to play in terms of deciding how it will invest that money and in what policies it will follow.
I agree what you're saying, the difference between the private market and what the state is doing, but the state is basically making the decision that they don't want to invest in ESG-related funds, as opposed to saying, hey, make the best amount of money, right? Our kids in our public schools need that money, or our teachers need that money. Make the most amount of money for them, as opposed to mandating the funds to say, do not invest here, even though they make a lot of money. That's what the issue that I'm having, right? That you're tying the hands of these funds or pensions and saying, do not invest here because of some policy that we may or may not like as a legislature, right?
Right. No, I
Some
understand the
yeah.
concern for sure. I think that's what was stated earlier. I think that's why there's clear fiduciary exceptions within it, and I think the idea is for some of these decisions for the blacklist, for example, to be something more of a tiebreaker when you do have options between different companies in the market providing similar products at similar fees. and there's not a clear fiduciary decision to go with one or the other, then I think you go with the one that is more aligned with your values, and you think will invest the money accordingly. So I think that's the important thing to do. And I think as far as I've read the bill, I think there's enough exceptions, fiduciary exceptions, to make that possible. And it seems from the testimony that those decisions have been made already. So yes, I think it's very important to keep that in mind going forward, that we don't overstep that. I think that right now we're positioned pretty well in that regard.
Okay, well, thank you.
Thank you.
Yep, Representative Plaza.
Thank you so much for being here. So I've listened to a lot of what you've been saying. You talked a lot about these activists that are persuading and forcing people to go into these ESG policies or use ESG as a risk assessment, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you're anti-ESG, right?
I'm anti it in the sense that I don't think that social environmental policy should be put above fiduciary returns, and also I don't think that we should be trying to enforce policy outside of whether Congress or the state legislative bodies trying to do that. Like, for example, endorsing the Paris Agreement, right? It's not the role of a company to do that necessarily. They can choose to do so, but that's not. Again, trying to create an environment where companies are pressured to do that, we don't support that.
Right, but you want companies to make the most money that they possibly can.
Right, absolutely.
And sometimes that means that if they engage in some kind of ESG portfolio and that makes them money, you're against that.
Not if it makes them more money, no.
Even if it's something that says that climate change exists, or that boards should have transparency, or that companies should have an equal number of male or females.
I mean, if there's a proven value to doing that from a fiduciary standpoint, then yes. I don't.
Yeah, always money, right? That's the goal here, is to make money.
Right, and also, I mean, there's a lot of times companies are doing this because they are chasing some kind of investment, right? So, for example, I mean, the Inflation Reduction Act has put out huge pots of money to go after zero emissions technologies, right? So if a company is pursuing that in order to make a profit, okay, then they tout their the fact that this is zero emissions, yay, rah rah, okay, that's up to them. We would take issue with the government putting out huge pots of money, but not with the companies pursuing that money. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, we've talked a lot about activist shareholders today, so I was just trying to figure out if you're an activist shareholder.
No, I personally no.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And have you read the Texas Business Association report?
Yes, ma'am, I actually have.
You have? Oh my God! Thank you so much. I appreciate you being prepared for the committee. Thank you so much.
So, if I could add to that, the report, what the comptroller was saying earlier, the report was based on the idea that underwriting spreads for local bonds in the state of Texas had basically doubled in 2022 and 2023 to the tune of like $250 million is what it cost. The Bond Review Board, 2 months after that report was published, the TAB report was published, the Bond Review Board came back and restated the data and showed that there was essentially no increase in underwriting fees over the last 2 years. So the report was based on basically data that was later retracted, and that's what the comptroller was talking about. So I actually don't encourage anyone to read that report because the data has since been retracted, and there's been no increase in underwriting fees at all from what I can tell. So
I just want to make one point. We're talking about the Texas Business Association, an association that has members like ExxonMobil as part of their association. So you're against ExxonMobil?
No, but I'm just saying the report was flawed, and as far as I can tell, they haven't retracted it yet. So I mean, we agree with the Texas Association of Business on a lot of things. I'm just saying that the report, the data in the report, and the comptroller wrote a letter to Congress stating this very clearly. The data that the report was based on was later retracted. So
right, and the comptroller is also being sued because of this bill. So there's a lot going on. Thank you so much.
So
I appreciate you.
What the purpose of the bill was and how we have to look at this is what we're not saying, correct me if I'm wrong, but what we're not saying is that a private company or an individual cannot invest in certain funds, right? We're not saying that at all. What we're saying is that the legislature has decided that as a matter of policy, its investment decisions as a consumer or as someone who would look at investing in a fund, we have limitations, and we do that in the Public Investment Act and things like even certain countries, right? So we're not investors in Russia, right? And I guess, but just because we're not doesn't mean that someone in Texas can invest in whatever they want. Is that right? Is that what the
Correct.
okay.
Yeah, that's how I understand it. Yes, and I mean and I think it's important that we keep that distinction clear.
And I mean, as legislature, part of the reason we did that is because we understand also that if you really want to focus on fiduciary investing and make sure they're responsible investing, we want them to be able to invest in anything that would be able to return dollars and not restrict their abilities, right?
Correct. Yes.
If BlackRock wanted to continue with Texas, they can change their policy, correct? And then fit our guidelines or our law. There's nothing that prohibits them from making those changes, correct?
Yes, correct, Representative Lou Wilson. That's right. And I think it would be our policy. It should be our policy goal to have no entities on the list. The goal is not to create problems or conflict; it's to resolve them. So one would hope that through the dialogue that is being produced, and as Mr. Kelly highlighted, that that companies will, choose to change their policies. Right? We can't force them to do that, but we can, through how we invest our money, right, give them an incentive to do so. Right?
Right,
I think
because
that's
it would
good.
be mutually beneficial for them to stay with us, to stay
Right.
in Texas investments. So just wanted to point that out, I guess, that there's nothing that prohibits companies. They do it all the time. I mean, they're in the money-making business as well, and frequently change standards or policy or whatever it is, or rules uh, to comply with different states, and they have the freedom to do that.
That is correct. Yes, and I think that it's important what you bring up. What they're doing is making a cost benefit assessment of what's good for them, and I think it's important. I think what some of the representatives have brought up already is that it's important for us as a state also to maintain a clear eyes on the cost benefits of our decisions of how we invest our money. If the cost of Senate Bill 13 outweighs the benefits, then we shouldn't have it, right? I think we'd all agree on that. So we need to have a clear eye on what the costs and benefits are for us, and companies will also make those similar decisions.
Correct.